Welcome to the Mobilize and Restore webinar series, and thanks to those of you that have continued on from the research talk. In this portion of the webinar, our speaker James Cotton will lead an interactive tutorial on fitting biomechanics from a sample monocular video using an end-to-end optimization-based approach. And again, we'll take some more questions at the end of the tutorial, and again, use that Q&A panel. And feel free to enter the questions as he's talking. With that, James, feel free to go ahead and start the tutorial.
All right. Oops, let me try again. Okay.
Looks good.
And hopefully people have the notebook up. Okay, I've done this workbook in person before, but I haven't done this before over Zoom. So I don't know how I'm gonna do it without feedback, but I'm just gonna walk you through it. Now, hopefully you guys have a video that you've recorded that's on your computer that is of you moving without other people in view. There's a default one it will use, but it's more fun if you can analyze that on yourself. In which case, what you can do is you can go into this file tab and you can upload your video there as the first step by clicking this upload button and then selecting a file, okay? And that should start uploading, and you can start then running the notebook in parallel. If not, as I said, there's a default one. The next thing you need to do, and hopefully a lot of people are familiar with Colab, so if you're on the web page, you're basically using a Python runtime environment that's hosted by Google using a Jupyter interface. And the first thing you need to do is change the runtime type to tell it that you want to use a GPU. And so if you do that, and then you click save, and then you should see T4 down there. And there's a small chance some of you will run into runtime issues because different people get allocated different amounts of memory, so it's not going to be perfect. And then go ahead and click this first cell. And this is going to do a number of things. Those of you that are aficionados can unfold that. This is, it's going to pull from one of our repositories. That's kind of the early release for JD's paper. Again, apologies, we didn't get the paper out in time for this, but it doesn't stop you having fun with it. And then once that's done, you're going to run this cell, and it's going to query the videos that are available, and it'll give you an option to select the video. If you've uploaded your own video at that point, it should give you a choice between the default video, which is called ASB Walk, and your video that you uploaded. While this is just ticking along, I guess I will just talk through some of the next steps. Okay, there we go. Wait, why did mine? Yeah, it ran all these, downloaded the video. Oh, there it is. Okay, I guess it ran too fast, and so I'm going to run this again. Oh yeah, sorry. If you only have one video, which I do, it won't ask you about the selector. That's what I was getting confused about. Next, it's going to show you a still frame of that just to make sure it is sane, which hopefully here you're seeing a frame from our data collection at the Society for Biomechanics meeting. Now, hopefully your videos, if your videos are recorded in portrait mode, this is not all going to work perfectly. As a kind of technical detail, when you put it in portrait mode, it actually doesn't change the video format. It actually just adds a flag to the video file, which I'm not handling in this particular code. But you could then set this rotated variable to true, which will at least make the detection work correctly, even if your overlays later will look messy. And so I'm going to come back and explain this figure here, but now go ahead and run this block here, these 5 hidden cells, and it will start running the video processing. And so just to kind of give you a high level of what it's doing. So first we're going to run that MetRabs algorithm that I mentioned earlier, or specifically the version of it that's trained on all of these different multi-person data sets. And that's actually what's taking a lot of the time in this cell, is actually loading up that model and constructing it. It kind of takes a couple of minutes to just initialize. Then, of course, you don't have the smartphone application. You just have your own video that you've recorded. And once you get these 2D and 3D key points, we're going to then, in the next step, we're going to create the representation of the kinematic trajectory, the body scale, and the marker offsets. And then we're going to start the optimization process, which we're not going to have a cool video that looks like this, but we'll basically kind of continue to minimize both the 3D reconstruction error. And actually, I think in this notebook, we do not include the 2D reconstruction error because to do that correctly, you should know what the intrinsic parameters of your camera are, which you can measure with a checkerboard like there is over there, but we don't include that right now. Okay, and then once this is done, this cell should give you a visualization of the 3D key points. So I'm going to run that. And then just because there's dead time, I'm going to try and answer some questions. Unless Matt, unless you want to moderate and tell me what to do, which questions to answer.
No, sure. If you like, you can jump right into the open questions.
Okay.
The first one from Daniel Harding is it possible to incorporate software like OpenSim models, like OpenSim with such modes of analysis as well as language models?
It's a good question, and I'm probably not the best person to answer it because I don't have the most open sim expertise. One of the things I think might be a bit of a challenge is because it's so dependent on modifying XML files and working with the file system, the nuance to do things requires a lot of human expertise that I think would be hard for something like the biomech agent to do. Now there are Python bindings for OpenSim, and I think if you had those, you might be able to create sets of wrapper functions and do very similar things to what I did with biomech GPT or with biomech agent. All right. What are
Yeah,
the accuracies for the static balance tests?
yeah.
So we do postural sway, but I don't think we broke down the accuracy for that specifically. Um, yeah. So, but for the timed up and go, yeah, timed up and go is actually one of the ones we do a little bit worse, partly because of the pelvis tracking when they're in the chair. So we're still around 3 or 4 degrees for that. But and yeah, I mean, I'm actually my RO1 is entirely on balance and stability and prosthesis users. So we actually send people home with wearable sensors. We have a cold cloud infrastructure that's collecting data, so we can track the kinematics of every step they take. Yeah, so we want that to be accurate, but we don't see any evidence it's much different other than the pelvis when they're sitting. Oh, drawbacks of monocular versus multi-view. So I think the main difference here is usability, right? So like single camera, much more usable, not as accurate. But as we're showing, it's accurate within a couple of degrees. And so I think for a lot of clinical applications, it's more than sufficiently useful. But I think even for some clinical questions, multi-camera markerless motion capture is not accurate enough, right? So like if you're doing surgical decision making and you're gonna cut apart a child and move their muscles and rotate their bones, I think you should probably have the most accuracy available, and I don't think markerless is there yet. So I think it partly gets into the spectrum of what your question is, what technology you need is kind of, and that's my general answer to a lot of questions around accuracy. I'm just gonna check in on this, make sure it's ticking through. Yep. So you can, if you unfold this, you can see at a certain point, it's about to start processing the frames. There we go. Now it's ticking through. Once it gets going, it'll speed up relatively quickly. Okay. Why do I use tug and Foursquare step test? I'm going to totally blank on this reference. Andrew Sawyer's had a paper a couple of years ago in prosthesis users looking at predictors of balance. And they had Foursquare step test, timed up and go, narrow beam walking test, and some questions around like activities of balance confidence, and found that the tug and the Foursquare step test were the best predictors in a multivariate regression. So we included those as the kind of state-of-the-art clinical predictors. I think they also do, I mean, I think there's a big, really interesting question around the right set of measurements to take about a person to sufficiently phenotype their nervous system, though. But I think the timed up and go captures some interesting things about how you get out of a chair and initiate walking. I think Foursquare step test, there's the reactive stepping component of it. And certainly we've seen people with like really interesting arm sways to like kind of compensate for their balance. Okay, so I'm jumping back over into the notebook now. And what you should see, hopefully, is something like this. Um, I don't know if anyone following along wants to give me any sign that people are keeping up. But okay, well, I'm gonna assume I'm not seeing technical problems. So now we're just gonna keep going. At this point, it saves the 3D key points just in case it crashes, but that's not doing anything. And then we're just rescaling this by default is in millimeters, but the rest of my code expects things to be in meters. We don't want to have one of those unit errors. And then this is kind of the heart of it. So I'm going to click run and then let it run for a second. And so there's two main parts to this. So I use JAX a lot in our code. So JAX is kind of an alternative to PyTorch and TensorFlow, and I love it because you basically can write fairly simple, straightforward math, and then just accelerate it on a GPU and parallelize it and vectorize it and all those good things. So there's kind of two main things in this function. One is the loss function. So we have this model, which is the representation of the trajectory, right? So this is that implicit function I told you about that is a function that can map from time to 3D joint positions. And then, of course, we also have a set of data that's past the loss function, which will be times and 3D joint positions. And then some regularization on the site offsets. And so then it passes those times through the model. And this does a lot of things that you don't need to worry about right now because it supports all that probabilistic stuff I talked about and the kinetic stuff and things like that. But what comes out of this is the 3D key points. And we did a lot of work when we first started on this and sort of standardizing the 3D key point representation between the biomechanical model and the MetrAb's algorithms, because there's a lot of key points formats out there and a lot of them are not good enough for biomechanics. But anyway, so it takes those 3D key points and it compares the predicted 3D key points to the measured 3D key points. And then that is the error, basically. And there's some details when we're doing it with the 2D reprojection error to track in absolute world space that is not being used here because, as I said, we don't have the extrinsics. And then there's a step function, which just basically takes a gradient step to optimize this. So it's using that loss function that I just described. And then finally is this fitting process, which is just setting up the optimizer and the loss function and then just repeatedly stepping, right? So, if you're not familiar with this code, it might look a little intimidating if you haven't trained neural networks. And this is actually exactly how you train a lot of neural networks. But as I said, in this case, we're training that neural network and then we'll throw it away in just a moment. And what you're going to see is it'll sit here for a minute. Don't worry, it's not going to take 110 minutes, but that first step, what it's actually doing is compiling the optimization process, and that takes a little bit of time. Once it's completed that, it should start running pretty quickly. And then we can you may want to go ahead and click run here because that step, when you pass it through the model for the first time, also takes a second. And then if you run this next cell, this will actually create a fun 3D visualization. And so this should be done in about a minute. Okay, in daily practice, what would be the average time required for the complete workflow? Well, I mean, so as I said, we're kind of a volume lab. And so we've had days where we've done hundreds of trials, and the step of like manually annotating is the one that requires someone to like actually check the data, but otherwise the computer just kind of sits and works on it for a couple of days. So it's not too bad in terms of human time per trial, if you know what I mean. Okay, what range of error in position is acceptable while validating the markerless motion capture key points using mono? Okay, so again, I'm gonna just say the answer to all questions about what level of accuracy is acceptable, 100% you can only answer that in the context of the question that you want to answer clinically, right? So in my mind, our clinical standard in rehabilitation is a stopwatch. So almost every method is more accurate than what we currently use, provided it's at least reliable and we're not tracking the wrong people, things like that. We don't know what the accuracy, so I'm really interested in precision rehabilitation and neuro rehab, and we don't know what the level of precision you need to measure someone is in order to make good predictions in clinical decision making. So we need to do that research. I don't think it's going to be tracking every toenail to micron precision, right? So I think there's going to be some sweet spot. I hope we're at the sweet spot. If we're not, that's why we do continue working on next generation algorithms, right? And we've got some fun things in the works. But I think we're at a place where we can already start to, if we can't find interesting clinical things at a couple of degrees, like it's possible they're just not there. Okay, and then can this work in future in sports movement analysis? Yeah, so we have used, we've done this. So my personal research area is not sports medicine, but we are using this in multiple sports projects, including with our multi-camera system and our single camera system. And again, this is where making this measurement accessible opens up a lot of questions. All right, and so hopefully you guys are now able to see something like this. When I do like an interactive version, I actually try and have people compute the knee kinematics off of the raw 3D key points and realize it's quite hard to build the right kind of cross product and things like that. But hopefully here you're seeing things that look fairly plausible. And then the last part of this is going to use a paper we put out a couple of years ago that we call the gait transformer. So of course, here someone's walking, but the thing you'd want to do immediately after you get someone walking is actually break down their gate cycles. And so what we did in the past was we ran, at that time, state-of-the-art pipelines to get 3D joint positions, and then we trained a transformer network that would actually map those onto gate kinematics, as well as actually joint angles, but spatiotemporal gate parameters. At this point, the joint angles you're getting from this new stuff is better than what we used to get, but the gate timing from this is still quite nice. And so if you actually run these notebooks, it's going to have to reprocess the video with a slightly different skeleton format, just because of the historical code. And then if you run the next two slides, things, you should get a nice little overlay video of you walking with your feet changing colors when the foot hits the ground. And then below there's a Kalman filter, which we could talk about the technical aspects, but basically is a way of smoothing the outputs from this, knowing some constraints about the timing of gate, and it will produce the gate events. So you should get some sinusoids that look like this. Those are kind of the relative timings of the 4 different gate events if they were represented instead of from 0 to 100% as a cosine. Okay. Follow-up question. What are your thoughts on training a vision model to directly estimate the musculoskeletal model parameters instead of the posed skeleton? Shoot, I'm not quite understanding you, Babak. But you mean, if you mean going from images directly to the kinematic parameters as opposed to going through the intermediate of 3D key points? Oh my God, I'm blanking on his last name. Georgios. Anyway, there was a paper recently, human mesh and skeleton recovery, that did exactly that. It wasn't validated on clinical populations, and there were some interesting details in there about taking the approaches that have been used for human mesh recovery and actually adopting them to applying to skeletons. Then have you ever explored the application of this technology outside the clinical space, such as in product development? I have not. Easy one there. I'm sure other people are, but I'm in it for the science. Have you tested the multi-camera system on diabetics? I have tested it on people with neuropathy. It works there. I mean, I think there's questions about what you'd want to measure. In terms of muscular dystrophy and ulcers affecting gait, I guess those are two separable questions, but actually one of my colleagues here who does a lot of work on cancer and cachexia is starting to look into using our models. And so I think we'll have some nice kind of data where we look at muscle distributions as well as walking patterns. I do think it will be related. I think there's just a lot of questions in there, most of which I haven't really leaned into too hard. Hopefully almost done with the overlay. And then, okay, there we go. So there you go. So as he walks, you can see that the foot turns red as it hits the ground. We get these waveforms, which, as I said, I would bet more on the newer waveforms than these older waveforms. And then at the end, this is just showing the reconstruction accuracy. So when this is low, it means it thinks the person's walking. And this is kind of the overall number of gait cycles in radians. These are the cadence in radians. Sorry, I should have probably converted these things, the relative offsets of the different gait events. And then finally, the timings of the initial contacts and the toe-offs. The question about using simulators for training deep learning models that can understand human movement, that's exactly what we're doing when we start coupling KinTwin with some of the the automatic programming or linking it to biomech GPT. So I think so. I mean, we're using Mujoko. I don't know why you couldn't do it with HiFiDi if you got it going there. But for us, it's just we need, it takes quite a while to I mean, we have tens of thousands of trials now, and so anytime we kind of switch simulators or body models, things like that, it's a big time commitment for reprocessing everything. What is the process of the calibration of the multi-camera system? Yeah, okay, and is there a possibility for non-calibration? So yeah, right now, we take that big checkerboard there, and we roll it around the room. We are using some code from Anipos lib. We're kind of updating that to use some more recent code from them, but it sometimes is annoying. We have some early pilot data, like prototyping code that gets rid of calibration. So there are algorithms now that use structure from motion that can actually look at the multi-view geometry and actually reconstruct the entire 3D geometry, including the camera positions. Those give us nice initial conditions. And because we can actually optimize the extrinsics during the calibration process. Um, I think we'll get there. It's definitely on the roadmap. I'm actually coupling a couple of things, including the multi-person association with that. So it's kind of a bigger project, but uh, yeah, I mean, so the measuring on a treadmill, we've done that. In fact, actually, as part of some of our sports stuff we did recently, we collected a bunch of treadmill data, including with like 120 FPS tablet stuff. And of course, we also do the drones following people. So, I guess I'd kind of almost go back to the motivation for Biomech GPT here, but it's now relatively easy to capture high quality within caveats of high quality, right? But it's easy to capture these things, then what do you want to do with it, right? And I think when you get onto a treadmill, you might want to actually be like correlating with treadmill speed and yada yada. So there's details, but in the scatter of the 3D scheme with the skeleton next to it, are those all of those 70-ish key ports being output? Oh, it's more than that. Metrabs puts out 550 key points or so. It puts out the superset of all of the 3D key points that existed in the training corpus they used. We select the 87 subset that was used in the MOBI dataset because we found those were sufficient for biomechanics. I would absolutely discourage using the 25 key points from Coco. It's not sufficient. Anyway, I'm being told we're at time, so thanks everyone. Sorry about
Yep,
those questions I didn't get to.
that's all right. So yeah, thanks again, James. And uh, yeah, thanks for answering all the questions. And unfortunately, we are out of time. And thank you for all the great questions that did come in. Um, so please be sure to click on the link that will appear at the conclusion of the webinar and take our survey. That'll help us improve the webinar series and choose upcoming topics. And this webinar series is supported by 2 grants from the NIH, including the grants to support our Mobilize Center and Restore Center. We're grateful for the support which allows us to run these webinars and other events. And thank you everyone for your participation. We hope you will continue to stay involved with our centers and that we will see you again in a future webinar. Have a great day.